Makes me want to holler. Chapter 15, Trapped. One thing I've learned, the mind is like the body. If you don't work actively to protect its health, you can lose it, especially if you're a black man. 19 years old and wondering, as I was, if you were born into the wrong world. The tricky thing about the mind is that when it's deeply troubled, it can shift tracks on you. It keeps working, you are thinking, but the mind shifts from logic to illogic without you being aware. Then one day, you step outdoors butt naked, wearing your underwear on your head, thinking that you're fully dressed. It didn't get that bad for me, but things were falling apart in my head much faster than they were coming together, and I wasn't alone. I saw it happening to most of the fellas around me. Greg, Shane, Cooter, my older brother Dwight. We were bouncing around like pinballs in a machine, wondering if the world was fucked up, or if we were. Wondering why we were being pushed into the back seat of life and couldn't get at the wheel. If you're the only person riding in the car and you're not driving, there's nothing to do but crash. Although I got off light on the rap with Plaz, life got no easier to manage. The shooting, the trial, and the time in jail were just a few in a series of troubles that began pouring in. Even the honeymoon with Liz began to dull. The responsibilities that came with parenthood were a bummer. We used to be able to jump up and do anything at any time. Then all of a sudden, it took 45 minutes to pack Pampers, bottles, and extra baby clothes just to go on a lightweight outing to the park. Being a father seemed like such a huge hassle, and I lacked both the will and desire to deal with it. So I started tipping out every now and then, hanging with chicks who had no children. I kept Monroe sometimes when Liz had to work, but I still couldn't get into the groove with the fatherhood thing. As the mother, who carried the baby for 9 months, Liz had no problem connecting from the jump, but I was just too young and immature to extend that kind of love beyond myself. So I focused on the practical matters that affected us all, namely money, which I never seemed to have. Compared to me, Shell Shock was Superfly. By the time we graduated, he brought a real gold tooth and paid cash for a deuce and a quarter, a Buick Electra 225. He put gangster white wall tires on his ride and cruised to Cavalier Manor, hawking drugs and supervising the guys working for him. One day, I went with Shell Shock to a house where he copped his supply. The dude who owned the house was a Vietnam vet who lived in Cavalier Manor. We got there, sat down in the living room, toked a few joints and talked. When Shell Shock and the dude went into the back room to transact business, I sat there, tripping and gawking at the tough furniture and slick layout of the place. Here was a cat in his late 20s or early 30s, and he had everything. A nice crib, a fine ride, a dynamite stereo system, and a monthly allotment check coming in from Uncle Sam. He had drug money flowing in too, and it appeared no hassles from the man. Sitting there, I realized that I needed to get smart. I needed to make some money and get back into the flow of things. Liz and I combined our funds, a couple of $100, and brought a quarter pound of reefer. I broke it down into smaller bags to put on the street. With that done, I set out to build a clientele. I made the rounds and got the word out that folks could cop from me. I quickly discovered that dealing wasn't as easy as it seemed. Selling reefer was a round-the-clock hustle that required more time and energy than I wanted to invest. Unloading a single ounce sometimes took up to an hour. Half the time, cats wanted to sample the stuff before they bought it, and even then they'd haggled over the weight. Man, I can get more than this over on Henderson Street. I'd have to be firm. Well, go on over to Henderson Street and get it then. Selling reefer also required more restraint than I could muster. I often got bored waiting for people to cop and dipped into my manila packets to smoke some here and there. Some nights I wound up getting so high that I didn't feel like selling anymore. Once I got high, I got the serious munchies and couldn't concentrate on anything but food, music, and sex. I eventually built up a decent clientele, but discovered that too had its drawbacks. Guys who wanted to score were always looking for me, pulling up by the carload in front of my parents' house and calling there all hours of the night and day. Dudes always wanted to meet them in out-of-the-way places to deliver the goods. I didn't have the advantage of beepers, phone recorders, and portable telephones like cats have today. I had to rough it, work the streets, and stay there most of the time. I had to hit all the hot corners to make sure I was accessible, especially on shipyard paydays and Mother's Day, the first of the month, when sisters in the projects got their welfare checks. Most of the time, I used Liz's car, a 1973 Buick Opal her mother gave her as a graduation gift. When I didn't have the Opal, I worked the streets on foot, trying to be high profile and at the same time avoid undercover narcs. Among dealers, the competition was stiff. I tried to gain the edge by offering more weight than the next man, which cut down on my profits unless I peddled the reefer with a little oregano. I also tried to lure buyers by putting out the word that I had some exotic brand of reefer known for its potency. Yo man, this shit is straight out of Mexico. This is monster herb. Or, yo blood, I got some cess from Jamaica that's out of sight. The problem was, most of the reefer on the streets at a given time came from one source. I didn't learn until later that a lot of top-level dealers from New York and other places controlled whole regions, meaning that all us low-level dealers were selling the same stuff. I also found that I damn near had to be an accountant to stay in business. I had to save the money I made and invest and manage it properly so that I could reinvest. That didn't go well either. I was too lax with spending. Hanging out there on the street, I often got hungry and spent a lot of money on food and drink, lost track of who owed me money, and squandered a lot of cash just having fun. Sometimes when sales were good, Liz and I threw small parties at local hotels or packed up her car and left town for weekend runs to Washington, a 4-hour drive away. Eventually, I realized it was too much work for me to try to hawk herb alone. Frog Dickey, who had returned home from the Job Corps, was unemployed and down and out, so I put him to work. With Tim dealing for me, I had to keep track of how much dope I gave him to sell and how much money I was due. I often wrote it down and lost the notes when I got high. My problem with dealing drugs didn't help my self-esteem any. I saw guys like Shell Shock managing their money, supervising hardheads and moving along, and I wondered what they knew about dealing that I didn't know. The bad thing about it was I was too proud to ask. The thing about drug dealing that bothered me most was that I had to be ruthless or act like I was. I had to be prepared to seriously hurt or kill friend, family, or foe if the need arose. I found out I wasn't down for all that when Frog put me to the test. After taking and probably smoking the stuff I gave him to sell for me, Frog dropped out of sight, which was a sure sign that he messed up my money. When I finally caught up with him, he put on a sad face. "Oh man, guess what happened?" he told me. "I was up at the 7-Eleven talking to some guys, and the lawmen came down on us from nowhere. They chased us through the path behind the store, and I had to ditch the stuff in the bushes. I couldn't take a chance on getting busted, man. You know how that is." I looked at him long and hard. "Hey man, you playing me for a chump or what?" "Nah, Nate, you know I wouldn't do that, man. That's really what happened. Ask some of the guys up at the store. Hey man, you know we go way back. You know I wouldn't rip you off." Frog put me in a position where I had to bust his head, as much to send a message to other folks on the streets as to punish him. If word got around that one person got away with running the Murphy, everybody would try it, and I'd be out of business in no time. That's the nature of the drug game. Everybody's either looking to get a free high, trying to steal drugs, ripping off drug money, or all of the above. Dope heads dumb enough to let their apartments be used as the get high spot often learn the hard way. Often, while everybody's getting high, Somebody in that group is scoping the furniture and appliances and checking out the locks. A few days later, the host comes home and hears an echo in his house as hollow as the Grand Canyon. The place is empty, and he knows that one of the 10 people he entertained and got high with made the hit. I knew that I had to fuck Frog up if I was going to keep dealing, but we had grown up together from junior high. I couldn't erase all the fun times and camaraderie over $100 debt, so against my better judgment, I let it slide, hoping I wouldn't regret it. Eventually, I gave up selling reefer, dumped Frog, and tried selling chemical drugs, orange sunshine, mescaline, window pane, purple microdots, Quaaludes that were easier to unload. Shell Shock's older brother, Ton, who was at college on a football scholarship, shipped to him large quantities of Quaaludes from Kansas where he got them cheap. He was breaking Russian records in college, but he was still a thug. I paid him $1 a hit for the Quaaludes and resold them on the block for $3 each. That went okay, but I had to unload 1,000 of those things to make any real cash. That turned out to be a bummer too. I finally had to admit that I lacked the discipline to be a good dealer. Dealing drugs is harder than any job I've had then or since. To this day, I laugh when I hear folks say drug dealers are lazy people who don't want to work. There's no job more demanding than dealing drugs. It's the only thing I really tried hard to do and failed at. I preferred to do drugs more than sell them. Drugs helped me get away from it all and escape the pain and confusion I felt inside. But sometimes it seemed the drugs were doing me instead of me doing them. Sometimes I had some really bad trips. Sometimes I'd trip out somewhere in public and damn near lose control. I'd get so high sometimes and stay ripped for so long, sometimes for as much as 8 hours, that I'd get down on my knees and pray to God to bring me down. The craziest part about tripping acid was the hallucinations. Actually, they were comical at times. Like the night I was driving down the road with Liz and some other folks while tripping on acid. I pulled into a parking lot on Victory Boulevard to take a leak. I walked over and started pissing on the side of a bus tire. Right before my eyes, the bus started melting. It was wild. It was as if the piss was so hot that it burned the rubber to a crisp. It melted into one massive glob of steel and rubber. I finished leaking and ran back to the car and asked Liz, "Did you see the bus melt?" When everybody assured me that the bus was still intact, I realized I was tripping. That acid would do that to you. You could be talking to somebody while tripping on acid, and their whole face would become distorted, large and rubbery looking, like a Halloween mask, or something somebody would say. It could be something simple and innocent, will be received in a different way than it was intended. I get paranoid and ask the person, "What the fuck you mean by that?" I found out through some trips that your reaction to certain drugs is largely a function of your state of mind at the time. Since my state of mind got to be pretty messed up with the passage of time, I had some bad trips that almost cost me plenty. One night, Liz and I were in a hotel we rented to throw a small party. Strobe lights were flashing and the music was pumping. We dropped some acid. Monroe was there in the playpen. He started crying. I went over, picked him up and tried to calm him, but he wouldn't stop. He kept on crying. It seemed that his mouth opened wider and wider. It got so wide that it looked like the mouth of a whale. I soothed and sang and rocked him, tried everything I could think of to quiet him down, but he kept crying, and the wails, the music, and the flashing lights were all coming at me at once. Then I started tripping. Why won't he stop crying? Why won't he shut the fuck up? Then it got worse. I guess all my resentment surfaced and all the pent-up anger I felt about everything gave in to the drug. And suddenly, I turned cold on my own son. Something inside of me said, "I bet if you slam his ass against the wall, he'll shut the hell up. Go on, sling his little ass." He kept crying as I stood there, holding him, listening to that sinister voice inside my head and trying to decide whether or not to obey. Ill logic ruled the moment. I wanted him to shut up, and he wouldn't, so there was only one thing left to do. I felt my arms raising Monroe higher, higher. Reflections from the strobe lights, flashing red, green, blue, were bouncing off the wall, and the music was loud. I raised Monroe and looked at the wall. The voice said, "Go on, slam him." I could feel myself about to give in to the urge. Go on, do it, do it. Then someone gently grabbed my arm. It was Liz. She stood beside me, calmly reached for Monroe and took him away. My temperament got worse with time. So much so that I got into a beef with my main man, Bimbo. He'd returned home from the army and, like the rest of us, wasn't doing much of anything with his life. For some strange reason, he crossed me. He told Liz I went to see another babe. It was true, but he was supposed to be my boy. Stick partners don't do that. Liz confronted me and asked if it was true. I lied harder than a white man and swore up and down that Bimbo didn't know what he was talking about. I think she knew I was talking out the side of my face, but she wanted to believe me. It was part of her own denial about how crazy life was getting for both of us. Meanwhile, I put the word out in the street I was looking for Bimbo. I decided I was going to bust him up. Bimbo was much bigger and stronger than me. I knew I probably couldn't beat him in a heads-up rumble. I'd have to bum rush him, pounce on him, and beat him with a stick or something without giving him a chance to recover. Sitting at home one day, I looked out the front window and saw Bimbo's green Monte Carlo pull up in front of the house. Frog Dickie was riding shotgun. This was my chance. I rushed into my room, grabbed a walking stick, and went outdoors to meet them. When we met in the street, I pointed the cane at Bimbo and said, "You ain't shit." He tried to look surprised. "What you talking about, man?" "You know what I'm talking about, nigga." Then I raised the cane and cracked it over his head. Whack! Bimbo fell back against his car. Before he could stand up straight again, I lunged at him, busting him in the head with the remaining half of the cane. Blood squirted everywhere. My mother, who must have been watching through the window, came to the front door screaming, "Nathan, stop that! Stop! Somebody stop him!" Frog, who had been standing nearby when the fight started, hung back and stayed away, a shocked expression on his face. Desperate, my mother telephoned Greg's father across the street. He came running outside and reached for the cane. I looked at him, pointed the cane and warned, "Mr. Sonny, don't try to take this stick from me." He backed off and tried to reason. "Nathan, give me the cane. You know you don't want to do that." Bimbo took advantage of the distraction to stumble to his car. He climbed inside and locked the doors. His head was bleeding badly. When I couldn't get the door unlocked, I started whacking his car, hitting the windshield and the hood and kicking the tires. In the background, I heard my mother screaming, "Call the police. That boy is going crazy. Call the police." Lost in what I was doing, I kept whacking Bimbo's car with the cane. I whacked and whacked until he started the engine and drove away. Several days after the run-in with Bimbo, I stepped out of the wintry cold into Shell Shock's house and greeted the fellas. "Yo, man, what's happening?" A chorus of greetings rang out from Cooter, Shane, and a few others who were lounging around in the den smoking reefer. Shell Shock, who had been in the back room when I first came in, strutted out front with a cigar-sized joint dangling limply from the tip of his lips. He took a deep drag and handed it to me. "Hey, little ugly nigga, where you been all day?" I took the joint, sucked in, and exhaled slowly, letting the smoke ooze through my nostrils. "I've been chilling, man. Got a lot of things on my mind." Without responding, he walked over to the stereo, lifted the top to the turntable, and put on a record album by Marvin Gaye called "What's Going On." The music started, and I settled back on the couch and listened, toking the joint whenever it was passed my way. Gaye's silky smooth voice, complemented by an alto sax, crooned through the large speakers filling the room. I heard the album before, but for some reason, tuned in really close to the lyrics this time. "Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, 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 There's far too many of you dying. You know, we've got to find a way to bring some love in here today. It was different from the romantic themes of most record albums that dealt with a range of things that were going on in the country. Poverty, racial unrest, the Vietnam War. The country was one big pressure cooker that seemed ready to blow. Gay sang, "Say, man, I just don't understand what's going on across this land." I sat there and thought about all the fucked up things going on in the world and in my life. I had no job, no money, no future. I felt lost, alone, out of place. My life was going down the drain, and I saw it happening and seemed unable to do a damn thing to stop it. I thought, my mom's is right. I'm going crazy, losing it. My mother had known for some time how troubled I was. She questioned me about the dark sunshades I sometimes wore at night. She found a pistol in my coat pocket. She'd answered the telephone and had anonymous callers tell her they were going to fuck me up. After the fight with Bimbo, she called her minister to counsel me. She was worried and trying hard to figure out what to do with me. I listened and Gay sang, "Nobody really understands." I knew I was hurting Mama. There were times when I wanted to tell her that I knew she cared, but my macho pride got in the way, and I could never bring myself to express my roiling feelings. Besides, I couldn't process my confusion sufficiently in my own head to explain it to somebody else. When they questioned me, my parents interpreted my stony silence as stubbornness. In truth, it was a reflection of futility. The gulf between what I instinctively knew was happening to me and what I could express was so broad that I gave up trying to explain. Gay sang, "We've got to find a way to bring some understanding here today." The futility ran so deep that it festered and churned inside me, quietly making gunpowder. I walked around feeling tense all the time. The only way I could balance the tension and the deep depression was to stay high all the time. Like the rest of the fellas, I had started getting high earlier and earlier in the day. Some of them had begun drinking and doing drugs the first thing in the morning. I knew I couldn't let myself reach that point. That's one step from being a drunk 24/7 on a park bench, but I was close enough that it worried me. My dress and appearance were slipping. I started wearing the same clothes day after day and didn't care whether the colors matched or not. I was starting a slow, steady process of wasting away. Cavalier Manor was filled with other guys going through the same drug-induced decline. I rested my head on the back of the couch, stared up at the ceiling through glazed eyes, and thought about the changing times. Things in my world and outside of it were changing faster than I could handle. Even things between Liz and me weren't the same. Around that time, when we were talking once, I broke down crying and told Liz I felt like I'd never been loved and feared I didn't have long to live. Later, Liz told my mother those things and I cursed her out for revealing my private feelings to somebody else. After that, it seemed like we were drifting apart. When relations among the fellas and me started changing, I knew my life had spun completely out of control. The break from my man Bimbo was just another indication of that. I thought about what had happened, how far back Bimbo and I went, and how tight we used to be. I didn't feel as tight with any of the fellas anymore. The deeper we got into the drug thing, the more paranoid and ruthless we became. Guys who'd been the best of hanging partners since way back when started turning on each other and ripping each other off. I couldn't even trust Shell Shock, my tightest stick man. I learned this during one of the last stick-ups we pulled together. My old buddy Cooter came along and served as a getaway driver while Shell Shock and I went and took off some dudes leaving the Norfolk dance hall. We made good money off those cats, but on the way back to the car, Shell Shock insisted we not tell Cooter what we got so that we wouldn't have to split it with him. Reluctantly, I went along, but later, when I thought about it, I concluded that if Shell Shock would rip off Cooter, he'd rip me off too. After that, I didn't hang with Shell Shock so much anymore. The vibe started to change between him and me. Marvin Gaye sang, "Mercy, mercy me. Things ain't what they used to be. Where did all the blue skies go?" I toked on the joint and considered the future. It seemed so vague. Life seemed to be closing in. I felt trapped. I was unemployed, broke, and desperate as hell. Marvin Gaye sang, "I can't find no work, can't find no job, my friend. Money is tighter than it's ever been." My favorite song on the album was Inner City Blues. It captured the depth of the despair I felt settling in. It was the only thing that came close to explaining the frustration churning inside me. It was the first time I heard someone put it all together in words like that. "Ah, it make me want to holler, the way they do my life. Make me want to holler, the way they do my life. This ain't living. This ain't living. Nah, baby, this ain't living. Nah. That's how I felt. I wanted to holler. Listening to that album, thinking about all my problems made me feel like crying. Absorbed in my own thoughts and carried away by the reefer, I hadn't realized that everybody around me had stopped talking. The fellows were listening and thinking too. I looked around the room and noticed the thick clouds of reefer smoke hanging heavily in the air. The lights were dim. It felt like all the time was suspended. When the album ended, nobody said a word for a long time. Like the others, I couldn't speak. We just sat there thinking.